Welcome back to TarHeelIllustrated.com. And if you're watching on our YouTube channel, Tar Heel Illustrated, I'm THI staff writer Jacob Turner, and joining me today, THI publisher Andrew Jones and THI football recruiting director Deana King. Guys, good to see y'all again. We're here to talk about the All-ACC preseason poll, as well as the All-ACC preseason football team that came out early on Friday morning, guys. First thing we're going to start with, let's start with that preseason poll. Carolina coming in at the top three, sitting at number three, just behind Notre Dame at number two. A little bit of controversy around that one. I've seen all over Twitter, some people not agreeing with that one too much, which I can understand. And Clemson, really no surprise there, sitting at number one. AJ, let's start with you. What's your thoughts on how that preseason poll shaked out, specifically with where Carolina ended up on there?
Well, first, I'm shocked that there's controvery on Twitter over a preseason poll.
I know,
Whoever
right?
thought of that?
That.
I don't know what the controversy is. I mean, North Carolina is certainly, I think, in the right spot at number three. You can't put Tar Heels ahead of Notre Dame just yet because they're coming off a 7-6 year in which they had to win their last three games to get to 7-6. I know that the losses weren't bad, so to speak. 6 losses by a total of 24 points, and they're 1 point to the game against Clemson. But they still lost 5 other games. So I think that Carolina's in a really good spot at number three. I wouldn't let preseason rankings bother me if I'm a Carolina fan and I disagree with it. Just let the games play out. And what's really cool is they're going to get a chance to play Notre Dame the day after Thanksgiving. And if something needs to be settled, it'll be settled at that point. And then a couple weeks later, they might get a chance to play Clemson as well if they're positioned themselves to make something matter versus Notre Dame. So I think 3 is a good spot for UNC. You can't argue with Clemson being number 1. I think they should be number 1 in the nation going into the season. And I think Notre Dame's going to be really good. And I think it's really cool that Notre Dame's in the league. We'll hit on that later on in this podcast. But it's pretty cool to me that maybe by the time fans are allowed in the stadium, Carolina could play its last 2 games at home against Notre Dame and at Miami, and it mean a whole lot. So the way that this season can build toward the climax is pretty cool, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it plays out.
Absolutely. Deana, what are your thoughts on how the preseason poll shook out?
I agree with Andrew. No doubt Clemson was going to be number 1. Notre Dame, a national power team. Being in the ACC for this year, who knows what the future may hold for the Fighting Irish in the conference football-wise. I like AJ said, I'd like to see them be a full-time member if they're going to be in the ACC, but they deserve a number 2. I agree about UNC being 3rd. A lot of talent coming back for the Tar Heels, so they will have their chance to prove it each week. And preseason rankings is just someone's opinion. All the sports writers, like Coach Brown says, a lot of it was based on last year, so they get to prove it each and every week, and it will play itself out.
Yeah, I totally agree, Deana. I really agree with what both of you guys said, but let's focus on the rest of the preseason poll. Obviously, like we mentioned, Clemson 1, Notre Dame 2, North Carolina 3. You got Louisville sitting at 4, Virginia Tech 5, Miami 6, Florida State 7, Pittsburgh sitting at 8, and just behind them is Virginia and Wake Forest at 9 and 10. Now you've got NC State at 11, Duke at 12. I'm sure a lot of Carolina fans will be happy to hear that State and Duke are not in the top 10. And then you've got Boston College at 13, followed by Syracuse and Georgia Tech to round out the ACC preseason poll. AJ, we'll go back to you. Thoughts on how that shook out, how the rest of the league shook out? Like I said, I'm sure there's a lot of Carolina fans that are pretty happy with where some of those fellow in-state schools sit at right now.
Well, the first thing that jumped out to me, and remember, I've been thinking about the ACC football in terms of Atlantic Division and Coastal Division for so long. I noticed that the Coastal Division looks like it's a little stronger based on those things on the preseason picks than the Atlantic. I think if you were to look at both divisions side by side and disregard Notre Dame for a moment, I think 1 through 4 maybe even 1 through 5, the Coastal would be stronger than the Atlantic. Now, of course, this is the year of COVID, so none of that stuff even matters. But I do think it's an interesting name that popped out. I think the ACC is going to be really interesting 4 through 6. I think that could shake up anywhere. And I think one of those 3 teams, Louisville, Virginia Tech, or Miami, could make a push and be in the top 3 and have a chance at Thanksgiving to actually still play in the ACC title game. I believe that the league is very strong this year, certainly stronger than it's been the last few years. But whether or not it's as good as I think it is depends on those teams. I think all 3 of those teams have a chance to uptick. And then, of course, if Carolina's as good as everybody thinks they're going to be, and then Notre Dame and Clemson are what we think they're going to be, I think the league could be really, really strong. And whoever plays Clemson in that title game may have a couple of losses because of the way the schedules work out. I think for Carolina, it works out very favorably because they get Virginia Tech at home, and then at the end they get Notre Dame and Miami. So they have a chance to generate big-time steam before they play the most important game on their schedule.
Absolutely. Deana, what are your thoughts on how the rest of the ACC shook out in the poll?
The middle of the pack is going to be an interesting race. You have Clemson up there on the top. And then I like Coach Collins, what he's done at Georgia Tech. I just don't think that the Yellow Jackets are going to be on the bottom. That's just my gut opinion because he made strides in that program last year. And so I know there'll be a much improved team this year. And let's see what Louisville does with Coach Satterfield's second season up there in Cardinal Country. It's going to be a really exciting year, and I do agree, like AJ said, the Coastal Division teams. You would have had Notre Dame, Carolina, Miami, Virginia Tech. All them get to play each other, so it's going to be an interesting race.
Let me jump in real fast. I agree. I think Syracuse finishes last, and which is why the 17-point spread that some people are talking about with that first game. And I'm not much of a spread guy, but I thought it was really interesting that there's been so little for people to chew on that they jumped on that spread and tore it to shreds. And I really believe that if Carolina is who we think they're going to be, that they're going to certainly beat the spread, so to speak, because I don't really have a lot of faith in Syracuse. The new defensive coordinator, Dino Babers, has had one good team, and that team barely beat Carolina. Had to go to overtime to beat them a couple of years ago. So I agree with you, Dino. I think Jeff Collins is a little unconventional in some ways, but I think unconventional right now in the opposite way that Paul Johnson was actually might work at Georgia Tech.
Do you guys agree that based on the poll, it's going to be Clemson and Notre Dame in that ACC championship? I know we've touched on it a little bit, but AJ, we'll start with you. Do you agree that that's what's going to end up happening ultimately?
I thought we were doing this next week. No, I right now I would still pick Clemson and Carolina in the ACC championship game because I think Carolina's schedule is very manageable. Notre Dame has to play Clemson in the regular season and has to go to Chapel Hill. So they should lose to Notre Dame at home. And if they lose in Chapel Hill, neither one of those would be bad losses at all, obviously. But if Carolina only loses once, let's say at Miami or at home to Virginia Tech, or maybe at UVA or something like that, they may stumble somewhere. That one loss, and they're able to beat Notre Dame at home, could get them into the title game. So plus the head-to-head. Let's say Carolina loses in Charlottesville and in Miami, and Notre Dame loses to Clemson and Carolina. That head-to-head, they'll be able to get into the title game. So I think right now I would lean toward UNC playing in the ACC title game. Although it doesn't mean I think they're better than Notre Dame. Notre Dame might have a little bit of an edge. Right now, if I were to say, okay, on this date, who's the better team, I would probably give a slight edge to Notre Dame. But I think 3 months down the road, Carolina might be the team playing Clemson and Charlotte.
What about you, Deana? Do you think it's going to be Clemson and Notre Dame, or do you maybe see a Carolina sneaking in there and ahead of Notre Dame there?
I still like my pick. I'm sticking with it. UNC and Clemson in Charlotte. Mac's going to say game day by day by day. So not to look ahead, but it's hard not to. There's a lot of excitement and hype around this team, and so they've got the tools to get there. So they got to go out each week and do that. And
let me throw in another team though that Carolina fans aren't going to want to hear this, because I think Virginia Tech is becoming a really disliked football program among Carolina fans. But if Justin Fuente is going to be there long term, he has to have a really good season this year. And they have a lot of parts that I can see them maybe being that team that's every year there's somebody that's better than everybody expects. And people already expect the Hokies to be pretty good. So if they're better than that, and North Carolina's defensive front doesn't quite, perform at the level people are thinking it might, even though it's proven nothing in the past, and they have some issues on the offensive line, which doesn't after 6 guys, your 7th guy is a true freshman center right now. I think if Carolina has some positive COVID tests or some injuries, I'm not sure the Tar Heels outside a linebacker in the secondary or a wide receiver have a lot of depth that can make up for it. So we have to factor in some of these other things. But Virginia Tech, I think, is in a position right now where the Hokies could actually be a team that is in that spot at the end if Justin Fuente turns in the kind of job performance that's going to keep him there long term. He enters the season on a little bit of a warm seat. I know a lot of Hokie fans, and they're not very happy with him, but I also think they're a little optimistic that this could be sort of a make or break year. And the optimism is if he's not worthy, dump him and find someone that is. If he is worthy, they're going to have a really good season, and maybe they're the other team that's in Charlotte in December.
For sure. I actually know I'm from Virginia up there, so I know a couple of Virginia Tech fans, and most of them that I know aren't too happy with the job that Fuente's done up there so far. But not to turn this into a Virginia Tech podcast or anything, but I can definitely agree with you on that, AJ, in terms of maybe a VT. You even got Louisville in there, second year under Satterfield, that could sneak in there. Miami, you never really know. Ton of talent down there, but how will they end up? Who knows? Before we move on to the preseason football teams, let's just talk about Notre Dame real quick. I want to go ahead and throw my problem with Notre Dame being in the league out there. I've seen this, some people echoing the same sentiments on Twitter as well, shockingly, right? I don't have a problem with Notre Dame being in the league. I think it needed to happen this year for things to kind of go ahead like they did, financial and all that kind of stuff. The problem I have with it is the fact that Notre Dame could win the ACC championship game, because they weren't in it last year. They come in one year, and then this time next year, they're probably not going to be in it again. So you can have a Notre Dame team with an ACC championship trophy sitting in their cabinet, and they're not really a part of the ACC. AJ, let me start with you. What are your thoughts on Notre Dame? Because I know you don't have a problem with it. That's just kind of where I sit in terms of my problem with them being in the league. I just don't think they should be allowed to win a trophy, but maybe that's just me.
Well, the road I've taken to get to this point has been a long, windy one through some tough terrain. And what I mean is 15 years ago, the idea of any of these non-traditional schools that are outside what was the original ACC region would have been uncomfortable to imagine them being in the ACC. I wasn't a big fan of BC being included, especially when it was by itself. There wasn't anybody else up there. It didn't make a lot of sense. But then covering the league, I saw how BC handled it and how BC embraced it. And I learned more about the school and about the culture and everything else. And really, if you're going to have Duke and Wake Forest, Boston College fits in a lot of ways. And I knew that Boston College was sort of the bait in the water to continue the expansion up north, would eventually lead to Syracuse and Pittsburgh and, Louisville. I wrote a column the day Maryland left when I was at Fox. I wrote a column saying, you got to go get Louisville. Louisville makes more sense. Louisville is an athletics upgrade over Maryland. And it will make more sense for the league because now, at that point, it was about survival. You guys remember the talk 8 years ago, 6 years ago was, will the ACC break up? Will Clemson and FSU and Georgia Tech go to the SEC? Will the SEC try to poach UNC or Virginia Tech? And there was a lot of concern the ACC wouldn't even survive. And so at that point, you had to ask yourself, do you want the league that you've grown up following, that I've been covering my entire career, to survive, or do you want it to just implode and when everything settles, it doesn't even exist, and all those teams that you were so comfortable with covering and had been familiar with and cared about your whole life are in 3 or 4 different leagues? Mm-hmm. And of course, what would have happened to a Wake Forest in a scenario like that? So it's about survival, and survival meant going and getting those other schools. And at this point now, not only is Notre Dame about survival, Notre Dame getting them in full-time in the league could be about maybe the ACC being right there with the SEC as the two best conferences in the country. It's a good thing for Notre Dame because they have a need right now. And ACC has stepped in and they've helped them out. Notre Dame's in the league for everything else, so it made a lot of sense. And so if this is a vehicle to get Notre Dame in the ACC full-time, then I'm all for it. If Notre Dame goes back to independent status, and that's the way Notre Dame is forever, the ACC still has their hooks in on them for 5 or 6 games a year. And if Notre Dame does win the ACC championship, they're going to hang an ACC championship banner in that fabled stadium forever. And I think that that's kind of cool. Sometimes things don't play out the way you want them to play out emotionally. Sometimes thought supersedes emotion. And this is one of those cases where I think it makes a lot of sense for the ACC. It's about survival, and it's also about generating more dollars so these programs can keep up. If you're going to sit at the big boy table, you've got to spend like the other big boys are, and Notre Dame will help everybody else spend the way they need to spend if Notre Dame becomes a regular member in football.
Made some really good points right there, AJ. What about you? What about you, Deana? Do you agree with Notre Dame being in the league this year? Or are you kind of on the fence about it like me?
Kind of like 50-50. Money and TV speak a lot in college athletics, as you guys know. This is a good opportunity for the ACC. I would just like for them to possibly join full time. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen with colleges and the NCAA and everything. And so Notre Dame was in a tough spot, and ACC helped them out big time. And I just think that Notre Dame could possibly raise the bar in ACC football a little bit more, have another national program. You have Clemson. To add a Notre Dame would be really good. You have Florida State, even though they're not the Florida State of old, but tradition, they got it. Miami had it. Hopefully North Carolina will raise their bar up to where Mac was the last time. So it's a lot of positive for Notre Dame staying in the ACC. And like AJ said, he kind of wanted to see the ACC stuff on Notre Dame. He saw the ACC on the field up there and on the touchdown Jesus up there in that famous field up there. So
it's historic. Seeing that patch on the uniform is historic. I covered a game up at Notre Dame in 2014 when UNC went up there. It's the only time I've been there for football. I've been there for some basketball games. And the place just oozes history. I mean, every gate has a statue of a former coach. And I know for all you Lou Holtz fans out there, Lou, he has the lisp, speaks with the lisp. So there's a very popular shirt that a lot of Notre Dame fans wear to games. It says "Lesh Go," L-E-S-H, Lesh Go. So when you walk around and you see shirts like that, and you see the statues of the great coaches they've had, and you go through the tunnel, it's those iron gates that are still there. And you've got touchdown Jesus outside the stadium over there. And I even took a picture of the great Tucker McLaughlin standing in front of one of those.
Legendary.
It's an amazing thing. You know, we have amazing basketball culture on Tobacco Road. And I've seen visiting media for years come into Cameron Indoor Stadium or the Dean Dome. And they're like, wow. Well, when I went to Notre Dame Stadium, I was like, wow, because so much has happened there. And to have that a part of the ACC football fiber, to me, would be an amazing thing. Look, Notre Dame's already been in the league for everything else. You know, the sun still came up, even though a team from Indiana, an hour and a half outside of Chicago, is in the Atlantic Coast Conference. It is what it is. So Notre Dame's in for football, and everybody in the league gets to make that trip every 3 or 4 years. That's a pretty cool thing. And just look at the predictions right now. Imagine removing Notre Dame from that. It would be – the national media would say Clemson and everybody else. Because until North Carolina does it, it's kind of hard to believe it. Notre Dame's done it forever. And just the mere fact that gold helmet is now a part of that, it gives the ACC a little bit more oomph.
Absolutely. I can totally see where you guys are coming from on that. And just to touch on it last time, if Notre Dame is to ultimately end up staying in the conference long term, I do think it's a great move for the ACC, trying to shed that light of not being a basketball conference and trying to be more of a football conference, which I think Notre Dame having them in there would certainly help.
To be clear, your objection is they got nowhere else to go, so they're just going to use the league for a year and then pop out.
Yeah,
That's a lot of people are saying.
Yeah, it's
and
kind of
get
the
that.
idea. It's just the idea of them coming in and leaving. It's just I don't know how I feel about that, but hopefully,
I think that's a legitimate take. I think it's a legitimate take. I'm just kind of trying to look at this more longer term because you weren't going to get it Notre Dame to join a football conference overnight. It's a slow courtship. It's like dating, and you're going to find the person of your dreams. You don't get married the next week usually. There's a courtship and there's a process for the ACC to get Notre Dame to not just dip its toes into the league, but really jump in for a year. Notre Dame fans are going to realize that the games still mattered every Saturday. They're going to realize that their tradition is still the same. They're going to run out of the tunnel in the same uniforms they've always run out of the tunnel. They're not going to take away all those Heisman trophies. They're not going to pull down national championship banners. Newt Rockney's still going to be Newt Rockney. Rudy's still going to be Rudy. It's just the world has changed.
Absolutely.
The landscape of college sports is changing. And for Notre Dame to maybe be what it wants to be, it might realize that that's the best move for it to make. I have no idea. But I think if you're ever going to get them in a league, this year's scenario is a blessing in that sense. I'm not saying COVID is a blessing, obviously. I'm just saying the scenario for maybe making that happen, it is a blessing for the ACC and perhaps to Notre Dame, even though most Notre Dame fans don't see it that way, that I've talked to anyway.
For sure. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out, even further down the road after this year in particular. But let's touch on, before we end it, let's touch on 3 North Carolina players voted to the 2020 All-ACC preseason team. You got Michael Carter, Dazz Newsome, and Chazz Surratt. And we've also got Chazz Surratt and Sam Howell receiving 1 vote each for the ACC Player of the Year. Sam coming in at 1 and Chazz coming in at 4, obviously kind of tied for that one, behind the likes of Trevor Lawrence and Travis Etienne, both playing for Clemson. AJ, we'll start with you again. Is there any – Michael Carter, Newsome, and Chazz Surratt, I think we can all agree those are probably good votes. Do you agree with those? And is there maybe anybody that you thought might be included in there that was not for North Carolina?
I think it's fair right now. I think that Marcus McKeithen and Jordan Tucker have a chance to be there at the end of the year. We got to see what the shakedown is in the secondary, who gets the majority of the reps. They're going to play a lot of guys back there, but maybe a Connor McMichael, maybe a Storm Duck. I want to see Patrice Renee 100% again. We haven't had a chance to see practice because of the COVID stuff. So I think they have some options back there. I think, if there's a jack of all trades guy on defense, maybe Trey Morrison could be there at some point. And offensively, I think Javonte Williams could have the kind of year which gets him on a first or a second team. But I don't think there's any guys really missing that should be there that are not there. I think it's fair right now. There's a lot of potential. Now Carolina, as Deana said earlier, they now got to show that's who they are. So by the end of the year, I wouldn't be surprised if there's more than 3 UNC players. But I think it's fair right now, yeah.
Well, what about you, Deana? What do you think about the 3 guys that are on that preseason team right now?
I think it's fair as well. And AJ mentioned a lot of guys that have the potential to be on the postseason All ACC. Mm-hmm. I know preseason, with me doing all my polls with NC Preps, I always get the things like, people getting upset that their players are not on there. But the most important is what you do during the season. The postseason awards are the ones that matter. All this preseason is just hype, and if Notre Dame was not in the conference, there might been a spot for a Marcus McKeithen or a Jordan Tucker on the offensive line. And look at Clemson. Sam Howell is right behind Trevor Lawrence, who is, the All-American. So I agree a lot with what AJ says. A lot to be played and a lot to be proven, and they just Javonte, I think, is going to have another breakout year. Mm-hmm. I just know that kid has been through a lot, and been a sleeper type kid, been not talked about a lot by a lot of people, and I think he's got a lot to prove.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Last thing I want to leave you guys with, and Deana, I'll start with you on this one. Sam Howell, like I mentioned, and Chazz Surratt, right behind Trevor Lawrence and Travis Etienne in terms of ACC Player of the Year voting. Does the fact that they're sitting at 3 and 4 in that category kind of show the trajectory, that this program is headed in right now?
Well, I think something come out this week about, I forget which publication it was, had top 50 or something, and Carolina had 2 players, and both of them were quarterbacks. Don't forget, Chazz was a quarterback. So technically, a lot of people were making a big deal about that, but Chazz has done a tremendous job to get where he is, and I can't say enough about what he's done and what all he's went through to be where he is right now. And Sam had that tremendous freshman year. So if they have good years, who knows? I mean, with COVID, what if a certain player misses half the season and Sam goes the whole season and rewrites record books? Who knows? It's just wait and see.
Yeah. What do you think about it, AJ? You think that kind of shows?
Yeah, on the face of it, it's cool. I think it's good for UNC. I was just trying to, when Deana was talking, I was trying to think in my back of my mind, when was the last time Carolina had a highly accomplished returning quarterback get preseason accolades?
Yeah.
Mitch only started that 1 year. Marquise had a really good year in 2015 after the South Carolina game, but he was hot and cold the year before. So he was one of those, well, he could be kind of guys. And then he eventually was for most of that season. Bryn Renner didn't get a ton, if I recall correctly. I know he was, a lot of people liked him, but he didn't get a ton of preseason mention. Darian Durant got somebody, played for some really, really bad teams. So it's been a while. I think Chris Keldorf may have been a first team preseason guy in 1997. But he ended up only starting about half the game because Mac was going back and forth with he and Oscar Davenport. So it's been a while for Carolina to have a quarterback in that spot. And I think what would be really cool about Carolina having a really good season this year is Chazz might get the national attention I believe that he deserves, and his story might eventually get told outside of the ACC Network's little chess playing thing that they did, which was kind of neat. But I thought Chazz would have been a bigger story last year. But I guess on a team that was 4-6 and had to win its last 3 games to finish with a winning record, there's only so much room for national stories on teams like that. This season, with 2 major conferences not even playing, at least right now, they're not playing, and Carolina having a chance to be a top 15, top 12 club, I think Chazz could end up being a really interesting national story. And you could have another one in Sam, being in the Heisman conversation. So I think it's really cool for Carolina, and it's kind of a rare thing. And for us who have covered this program for a long time, it's different, and we like different because that means we write things we haven't written very often before.
Absolutely, absolutely. Great stuff as always, guys. I'm glad we're able to sit on here and actually talk some preseason football polls and teams because you know what that means. We're not far away from the season actually starting. So, AJ, Deana, thanks for joining me on this one. Be sure to like this video. Be sure to share it if you've enjoyed it. Be sure to subscribe to us over at TarHeelIllustrated.com. We've been covering UNC full time we've been going hard. We haven't been traveling to Chapel Hill as much with all the coronavirus stuff, but we've got new content up there every day, football, basketball, and recruiting as well. So be sure to subscribe over there and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And as always, guys, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thanks for stopping by.